So here we go. Now, this was a King's Indian. And as far as I know, Fabi, I don't know if he's ever played... I mean, I'm pretty sure he has played the King's Indian before, but he's not really a King's Indian player. And I think the reason that Fabi chose to play the King's Indian is because he sensed that Wojciech is not in very good form. Thank you, Mr. Perich. Wojciech is not in very good form. He had lost several games in this tournament, and I think Fabi just sensed that he needs to play for a win with the black pieces, and an opening like the Queen's Gambit declined or a Ragozin is just not going to cut it. Wojciech is a super solid player, and I think Fabi reasoned that he's just not going to have realistic chances to win unless he plays something very unbalanced, and apparently it was the only second time he played the King's Indian, which is amazing. To play it on such a stage against such a player, that takes some guts. Okay, so it's a mainline King's Indian until Fabi plays a very unusual move in this position. Now, this is like the main line of main lines. And in this position, the move Knight c6, as many of you guys I'm sure know, is the most popular move. That is what's considered the main line, or the Mardol Plata variation. And this leads to the very famous kind of King's Indian positions where white attacks on the queen side and black attacks on the king side. This, by the way, is called the bayonet attack, the move b4. That's like the hottest of the hot. Now, in my career, I haven't played Knight c6 very much. I've played a variety of sidelines in these positions. There are three main sidelines. You can get the knight to a6, which may look weird until you realize that after white plays d5, which he shouldn't, by the way, because that would justify the placement of the knight on a6. Where would the knight go? And this is a very typical King's Indian idea. This knight goes to what square? This knight goes to c5 in order to exert pressure on the e4 pawn. And then we play the move a5 in order to prevent white from playing b4. So that's another sideline. Black can play e takes d4. This leads to a very interesting kind of structure that I'm sure you've seen me play many times in Blitz. And finally, the move knight b to d7 is called sort of the old main line. The knight b to d7 is what people used to play almost exclusively until knight c6 came around. But Fabi plays yet another move, which, according to my reference here, has only been played. It is a very unpopular move. It's been played in terms of popularity. It's knight c6 followed by e takes d4, followed by knight b d7, followed by knight a6, followed by c6, followed by knight h5, followed by queen e8, followed by a5, and only then, with 119 games, the move bishop g4. Now, it has been featured in quite a few Grandmaster games. So, although it's not very common, what I'm seeing here, and you guys can see part of the reference here, is that a lot of Grandmasters have actually played the move bishop g4, which tells me that it's probably not that easy for white to prove an advantage. Yeah, I'm sure that Fabi prepped this. Now, the idea of this move is quite transparent. I don't think Fabi is hiding what he wants to do here. What he wants to do, and what he does do on the next move, is to take the knight on f3 and soften up white's control over the center. Now, if you think about it, this bishop on g7, its ultimate aim is to exert pressure down this long diagonal. By taking the knight on f3, Radoslav's control over his own d4 pawn would, in theory, be weakened. I think that's like the general notion behind this move, right? One sec. Thank you, Squanchnutty, for the tier 1. Okay. So Wojciech goes bishop e3, and he does that in order to remedy that situation, in order to give the pawn on d4 another defender. 300 bits from Cordyceps. Now, there is... now, the main line in this position, the most popular move, is to play d5, and simply to close down the center. And closing down the center, to me, makes a lot of sense here, because the whole point of bishop g4 is to soften up white's control over the center. So by closing it, white could render this move a little bit awkward. And using reference here, the move a5 is sometimes played. I'm sure that Fabi probably had some sort of preparation here. I don't know if it involved taking the knight on f3, which, by the way, is very unusual in the King's Indian. But I'm sure that Fabi anticipated d5 and would have done something interesting here. I see that there is a Serbian Grandmaster, I think Serbian, Jur Skobern, who plays the move knight h5 a lot. So maybe it was this move that Fabi had prepared. And in any case, Radoslav goes bishop b3, Fabi takes on f3, and now Fabi takes the pawn on d4, which reaches this very interesting structure. Now, what's very unusual is not the structure itself. This structure itself is not unusual in the King's Indian. As I've told you guys, now if we go back to the main line position, e takes d4 is very common. I've played this move many times myself, and it reaches exactly this kind of pawn structure, where it's sort of like a Morozzi bind, where you have a c pawn rather than an e pawn, if you think about it that way, if it helps. But what's unusual about this is that black has actually traded the light squared bishop for white's f3 knight. That doesn't happen very commonly in the King's Indian. Now, who does this favor? It's very hard to say, because on the one hand, that knight on f3 was seriously protecting white's central control, but on the other hand, two bishops are two bishops. And with the position being kind of open, in theory, the two bishops should favor white. So my guess here is that perhaps white has a very small edge, objectively speaking, but it seems to me quite clear that Fabi had prepared this type of position at home. And so he plays knight c6, getting his knight out. Radoslav, and please feel free to ask me questions as I go along. Radoslav drops his bishop to e3. Now, of course, white does not want to give away his dark squared bishop here. That would be positionally horrible. It would give this bishop an uncontested long diagonal. And Fabi plays another extremely logical move, rook e8. So far, he's not doing anything extraordinary. He's bringing the rook into the game, and he's applying a little bit of pressure on the c4 pawn. Radoslav's response is similarly quite mundane. And according to my reference here, this position had occurred twice before. One of the games was a strong game. White was 23-39 and black was 25-67. And in that game, the move chosen by white was queen c2. But here, Radoslav goes queen to d2. Would I have considered bishop takes c3? Well, I'll get to that moment in a second. So queen to c2 I kind of like because it does overprotect the c4 pawn. But queen d2 also looks like a perfectly fine move. You build up a little battery. You connect the rook. So far, nothing to write home about. And now knight d7. Yeah, no spoilers, please. Now knight d7. Now, what is the purpose of this move? Who can explain to me, or who can at least attempt to explain to me why move the knight back from f6? There's a couple of things that this move accomplishes, at least in my eye. And it's the next move that's really shocking from Fabi. Yeah, so essentially this knight can maneuver itself to one of two squares. Either, well, first of all, it opens the bishop. It opens up the bishop. Now, I don't think that you're preparing f5, right? Because f5 is a move that you only really play when the position is closed. When the position is open like this, the move f5 does more harm than good. If you think about it, then after e takes f5, g takes f5, this pawn becomes super weak. And white can actually pick it off by playing queen to d5 check. So it's more that this move opens up the bishop and allows it to really occupy that diagonal. And the knight can be rerouted either to e5 potentially or to c5, both of which have their purpose, right? The knight on e5 would attack the bishop potentially and attack c4, whereas on c5 it would exert pressure on the e4 pawn without blocking in that f6, that dark squared bishop. So Radoslav brings his rook into the game, rook a to d1, and here comes the shocking move. And seeing this move played is quite a shock even to me. And as Dr. Mad revealed to us, the move that Fabi played here, which I think will stun the world for months to come, is bishop takes c3. He takes the knight with his bishop. 1 second. I need a chip and salsa after this move as I let it sink in for everybody. Why did he take on c3? Alright. So, there's a lot that appears to be very wrong with this move. This looks like a horrible move. This is the kind of move that if you saw this played by a beginner, you would kind of smile and you would say, a young one, you really don't understand these positions, do you? I mean, if you just look visually, to give up such a bishop is exceedingly rare in the King's Indian. Largely because, well, first of all, the bishop itself is a very strong piece. It's fianchettoed on the long diagonal. And also by giving it up, black is creating massive weaknesses on the king side, which may appear to the untrained eye, white can exploit by going bishop h6. And that would immediately create a mate threat on g7. The bishop serves as the protector of the king. It serves as what seems to be black's strongest piece, and Fabi takes it and gives it away for a knight on c3 that isn't particularly doing anything at all. And, I mean, this is quite shocking to me, but I think I've thought about this move beforehand. And I have a couple of ways I think that I may attempt to explain why it's played. I'm quite sure that this move was preparation. He accidentally took the knight by mouse slip, exactly. So first of all, the concept of getting two knights against two bishops is not a new concept. And moves like bishop takes c3 do occur in other types of openings. Like, for example, there's a line in the English defense. Let me see if I can remember. There's a line in the symmetrical English defense where white plays d4, takes, black plays g6, knight c3, bishop g7, knight c2. And in this position, this used to be a very popular line, but along came people like Bobby Fischer, and they started taking on c3. Which, at first sight, looks, crazy. How can you give up such a bishop? You create a hole on g7. And in Bughouse, this would be unthinkable. But it turns out that the weaknesses in white's c-pawns basically justify this entire approach. And it also turns out that white can't really exploit the weakness of black's dark squares, because the knight quickly comes out to f6. And even if black castles, just because white puts the bishop on h6, that doesn't mean anything inherently. The bishop just kind of chills there, but not in a good way. It's not really doing anything. And it turns out that white's pawns are kind of beginning to collapse. So that's only one of many variations where this move bishop takes c3 does occur and is very well known. So if we were to compare that situation to Fabi's capture, then we can kind of see one, I would say, specific similarity, which is that if you look at white's bind, particularly that e4 pawn, the e4 pawn is really weakened as a result of this trade. Thank you, Chaser, quick. Okay, the e4 pawn is actually quite weak. It's defended now only by the bishop, and it's never a good idea when a piece is very much tied down to the defense of a pawn. And if you think about it, this knight on d7, let's not forget where it's going. This knight is going to c5, where it's going to actually attack this pawn on e4. And white's bishop, bishops are obviously very versatile pieces, but they're not very good when they're sort of stumbling around weak pawns. They're not necessarily the best defenders of weak pawns, thank you, the processor. And both the c4 and e4 pawns are now, in the absence of the knight that kind of serves as the glue piece, kind of weak. Now comes the question of how black is able to defend against various threats like bishop h6 and enter Fabi's next move, queen f6. This move offers a queen trade. And if white accepts the queen trade, amazingly, he just loses the pawn on e4. The pawn on e4 cannot be defended. So we very clearly see the meaning of the move bishop takes c3 here. That pawn, the weakness of the pawn on e4, that very concrete property of the position justifies something as seemingly drastic as giving up the bishop. Now, basically what Fabi says to white's queen is, shit or get off the pot. If you're not taking on f6, then white's queen has to move away. But if white's queen moves away, then ideas like bishop h6 lose a lion's share of their effectiveness because they no longer threaten checkmate on g7, right? Well, the problem with the move knight to e5 would be twofold. First of all, that knight on e5 is not very stable. How can white try to chase away this knight in the future? What would white do if we had instead played the move knight e5? And please stop me if I'm not making any sense. I probably am not. This is not an easy thing to explain. I myself am not positive in the things that I'm saying. Well, it's not rook d5, because if it were black to move, I would definitely take that bishop on f3 and ruin white's kingside pawn structure. But the simplest would be to go bishop e2 and then to play f4. But on another more conceptual level, think about this knight. Do you actually want it to be on e5? It's blocking the rook's access to the e4. Whoa. There we go. It's blocking 3rd time's the charm. It's blocking the rook's access to the e4 pawn. And that's exactly what we want to attack. I think this is computer analysis. I mean, I think that by and large, this is the product of computer analysis. But the reason that the computer suggests this move is because it transpires that these very specific properties of the position, in particular the weaknesses of white central pawns, combined with the fact that the bishop on f3 is very passive, is justification enough to make a move that, from a purely positional standpoint, seems to be completely unthinkable. So queen to c1 by Wojciech. Fabi goes knight c5. And Wojciech goes queen b1. He now has to tie down the queen to the defense of the e4 pawn, which is a very, very sad use of resources. And yet, I heard in some commentaries, I think the opinion was expressed that Wojciech should have just sacrificed the pawn on e4 and at least gotten activity for his pieces. So one move that comes to mind, maybe something like a3, knight takes e4, b4. I don't know. Maybe try to get some sort of piece activity on the queen side and see compensation. But you can imagine how hard it is to go for something like this if you've never seen this idea before. And by the way, the reason bishop takes c5 is going to be bad, and this is a very instructive moment, because this is a classic example of bad bishop against good knight. Look at this bishop. It's staring at the e4 pawn. Now look at this knight. Where can this knight go? Does this knight have an outpost? Yeah, it certainly does. And that's not just any outpost. The knight is going to be completely unassailable. Completely unassailable. On that square. Okay? And we are going to permanently blockade white's bishop. We're going to bury it. We will bury you, as Khrushchev said, with the move rook e5. Okay? So taking is very, very bad. But if you don't take, then that pawn on e4 gets under even more fire. And so queen b1 by Wojciech. Fabi goes queen e6. So his play in this part of the game makes perfect sense. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? This is a fork. White actually loses a pawn here. The bishops are not able to sustain a prolonged defense of these two weak pawns. And so here we can very clearly see the sort of concrete justification of taking on c3. This is where this is the crux of why Fabi took on c3. Would bishop g5 work threatening the rook and knight? In which position, Ryan? Thank you, Derpy, gifting to upper thighs. Well, b1 is not a good square for the queen, but it's the only square for the queen. I think Wojciech could have also defended that pawn with queen c2, but probably he didn't like the look of... What didn't he like about queen c2? Let me think. I mean, maybe the fact that knight b4 comes with tempo, although I highly doubt it. I'm not sure why Wojciech didn't go queen c2. Yeah, because maybe he should have gone queen c2, because queen b1, I think he might have overlooked this. The benefit of going queen c2 over queen b1 is that queen e6 is no longer a fork. Here, we only attack the e4 pawn, which means that white can make a move such as rook fe1, which Wojciech played this move in the game. But in the game, his c4 pawn was also hanging, and here he can focus his attention on creating an indirect defense against the e4 pawn. Thank you, Swapster, for the print. So queen b1 by Wojciech, queen e6, and Fabi actually wins the pawn. b3. He brings the queen up to c3. Wojciech tries to get that queen out. Fabi says, okay, I'll bring my queen back to f6, and already black is much better. He's up a pawn. The knights are beautifully placed both on protected squares, and bedazzled fine muck. And bishop c1 by Wojciech. So Radoslav is, once again, he's trying his best to get this bishop back onto the long diagonal. That is really his only chance, in my eyes, to generate some sort of counterplay. You know, his only source of counterplay is this long diagonal because black no longer has a dark squared bishop. And the reason, by the way, that he took on c4 instead of e4, if you think about white's last move, rook f to e1, that created an x-ray against black's queen. So taking on e4, I think, would have played into white's hands, and perhaps Radoslav can even play bishop takes a7 here, exposing the attack on the e4 knight and restoring the material balance. So does that make sense? Am I making sense so far? I don't know Once again, please don't be shy about clarifying things as you have been. But here we reach the stage of the game where Caruana, I think, just accumulates the pressure on the kingside. So the knights are beautifully placed. This knight on c6 is the only... Well, this knight on c6 has further prospects. It can go to e5 at a time of black's choosing. It can also potentially go to d4, although the d4 square is a little bit more loose because you cannot support that knight with the move c5. So Fabi plays h5. He improves the position of his pawns. He grabs some space on the king side, and it's very clear to me that he's preparing to attack on the king side using his knights. The bishop b2, and now he says, no, you ain't getting that long diagonal. He goes knight e5, sticks that knight in between the bishop and black's king, and attacks, of course, the bishop on f3, which Radoslav has to move. Now Fabi grabs even more space on the king side with the move h4. And by the way, one of the reasons behind playing h5, h4 is that later in the game, Fabi may have the possibility of actually pushing the pawn even further. And this is a concept that I call carving out. You're carving out squares near white's king on which you can then put your pieces. So if g3, for example, what square have we carved out? And what piece could we potentially put on that square? And I actually see kind of a nice line here that perhaps may faithfully illustrate it. Well, first of all, yeah, g2 and f3. So we can play knight f3 check. And if bishop takes f3, then guess what? It's a lobster pincer checkmate on g2. But if white moves the king to h1, it may appear that black is overextended. Queen is being attacked. Bishop is making contact with the knight. But here I think black has a very beautiful move. Black to play and win. This just gives me a chance to take another bite of a chip. Boom goes the dynamite. Oh, we blundered our queen. Oh my god. No, we didn't. Knight takes f2 is checkmate. Knight takes f2 is checkmate. So that would have been a pretty nice conclusion to the game. Of course, Wojciech has no intention of allowing any of that. And so he plays the move queen to c1. He's like, I am shutting this whole operation down. How is he preventing h3, by the way? How does the move queen c1 prevent the move h3? Alec, yes, it does weaken the king side. But what Fabi is basically saying is that white doesn't have the resources necessary to exploit this weakness. I always give the analogy of a tree falling in the forest. If nobody is around, does the tree make a sound? It's the same thing here. Just because you push a pawn in front of your king doesn't automatically mean that, that your king is going to get checkmated, because an attack depends not only on the weaknesses, but on your opponent's capacity to exploit them. And here, white just doesn't have that capacity. So the move here is f4. By putting the queen on c1, Wojciech prepares to play f4, and this would win the knight on e5. So Fabi goes g5. And he pushes another pawn in front of his king, but this time he stops the move f4. And another reason that I think he's able to get away with this is because he's got this queen on f6. And the queen is really the glue piece. It's holding everything together. And also Fabi has all of these pieces near his own king, which means that he's not really afraid of making a move like g5. To the contrary, white is the one who's got to be afraid. Bishop b5, attacking the rook, rook e7, moving the rook. Another instructive moment, by the way. I think a lot of people might instinctively want to play the move c6. But why would this be inaccurate from a conceptual standpoint? Why would the move c6 be worse than moving the rook? Because it weakens d6, exactly. And there's absolutely no need to create these weaknesses when we can just as well move the rook to e7, no problem. Rook to e3. So I think white is trying to defend, again, against the threat of h3. h3 was now once again a very serious threat, so he defends against it. Fabi repositions his queen on g6, pressures the e4 pawn, gets the queen out of the pin once and for all. And guess what? This x-ray against white's king, you should already notice it, because that could become very significant later on. Bishop e2 by Wojciech, trying to bring in the beef up the security around his king. And Fabi, he looks around the board, he identifies the last remaining piece, which is not doing anything, that is the rook. and he brings the rook into the game. Look at how harmoniously all of his pieces are playing. He constantly is improving the placement of his pieces. Now, I know a lot of you are probably wondering why knight takes c4 was not played here. And I believe that the reason is tactical, although I'm not, don't quote me on this, but perhaps white has the move rook takes e4. And I believe that now black does pay the price for advancing his pawn so audaciously in front of the king, and this creates counterplay against black's king, which I think Fabi just has no need to allow, and so he instead just calmly plays the move rook a to e8, queen to c2, and now he plays another very instructive maneuver. Now, there's this notion, and I'm sort of translating from the Russian, of a piece having done its job. You have to be very flexible in relation to how your pieces are placed. A piece could be doing an amazing job on a particular square for 10, 15 moves. And then it's very important to identify when a piece has completed its assignment on one square and when it's needed, perhaps on another side of the board. So black has finished with white's center. Black is no longer interested in winning this e4 pawn. In fact, this e4 pawn is part of the reason that white's pieces are as passive as they are. Now it is time to orient black's pieces toward a kingside attack. And looking at this knight, right now it's a vestige, right? It's performing this relatively unnecessary duty of pressuring e4, and instead Fabi deploys it to f4, knife f4, and now you can see the storm clouds gathering around white's king. Bishop f1 by Wojciech, and now Fabi plays the move c6. Now, didn't I just say that the move c6 is bad because it weakens d6? Why is Fabi doing this on his own volition? Well, the circumstances have changed a little bit, and because he senses that white's king is so weak. When the king is weak, the sort of common prescription is to open up the center in order to allow for better exploitation of that king weakness. So here Fabi is very specifically preparing to rip open the center with d5. That's all he's doing. He understands that the pawn on d6 is weak, but this is a purely temporary weakness. Once he plays d5, he will no longer have that weakness. Well, if bishop takes c5, then d takes c5, and don't forget that this now becomes once again an incredible outpost for the knight. Okay, yeah. So I think one key point here is that in general it is beneficial for the two bishops when the center is opened, but here you just need to compare the activity of the pieces. Look at how active black's knights are, and look at how passive this bishop is. This bishop on b2 is active, but in and of itself, it's not going to tackle black's entire army alone. Okay, so Fabi just basically concludes that because his pieces are so much more active, the time has come for him to open the center, but he does so very patiently. Before playing the move d5, he makes one more minor improvement. Minor, but very important improvement. He plays the move rook to e6. Just making sure that, you know, the rook kind of maybe defends the queen. Maybe it'll later lift itself to g6. Also, just protecting the 6th rank against any kind of freak ideas. Fabi is in no hurry. White is completely devoid of counterplay. So Wojciech goes rook c3, and there goes d5. And here, the position simply collapses. Well, if you had gone h3, this is no longer that effective because white can go g3. And if the issue is we don't want to move this knight away from f4, because if we do, then white will be able to take on h3, and all of a sudden the tables have turned. So the knight on f4 is very well placed. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. d5, g3. Yeah, he did. He played g3 anyway. And after hg, hg comes the tactical stage of the game. Now, Fabi has activated his pieces to such an extent that even without the f4 knight, his position is absolutely devastating. He plays d takes e4, sacrificing that knight on f4. And I believe that Radoslav should have taken on e4. He should not have accepted the knight. I'm pretty sure the black is somehow still winning. Maybe the simple knight h5, knight f6, going after that e4 pawn after all would have been a good idea for black. But at least the game goes on. Radoslav, in time pressure, plays g takes f4. He accepts the knight, after which Fabi takes back. And queen g2. It appears actually that that white has succeeded in trading queens. And guess what? White is up a bishop. But here Fabi plays the final stage of the game absolutely brilliantly. The absolute temptation, of course, is to take on f3 with the knight. But after rook takes f3, e takes f3, queen takes f3 check, queen takes g6 check, If you take with a rook, then white goes king f2, and white is actually quite fine. White's got two bishops for a rook and a bunch of pawns, but these pawns are tripled, which means they're probably going to be lost. But it turns out that the knight on e5 is a crucial attacker. It should not be given up at any cost. And so Fabi plays e takes f3. Now, of course, if you play rook takes f3, then after knight takes f3, the knight is untouchable due to the pin. And so Wojciech is forced to capture on g6, after which Fabi takes back. And here's the key idea. If white goes king f2, it may appear that white has finally escaped black's clutches, but the killer idea, and Fabi had to have seen this when he was sacrificing the knight, silent but deadly move. What are we thinking about here? We want to go knight g4, but we can't. We can't because they take on f3. Can we prepare? What am I even saying? Can we protect that f3 pawn first before playing knight g4? Bingo, rook g3 is correct. And white simply cannot stop the devastating threat of knight g4 checkmate. If white drops his king to e1, well, that may stave off the checkmate, but it's not going to change the outcome of the game. Knight d3 check and knight takes b2. Look who's in the chat to offer his input, GM Hess. I don't know who that person is. But I was going to say the commentary was exceptionally terrible. I think Hess should step in to actually help out the commentary team because they're really suffering. But that is the key point. Without this move, rook g3, white would have actually recovered. And so king h1 is a sad necessity. Now Fabi goes f2 and prepares to drive the rook into g1. Radoslav has to play bishop h3. And the final two moves of the game, absolutely superb tactical vision by Fabi. He realizes that he wants the rook to get to e1. And if the rook gets to e1, the game is over. But just moving the knight anywhere gives white advanced notice that we want to play rook e1. So if you play knight d7, for instance, then rook c1 would have followed, and at least white prevents rook e1. So Fabi understands that he has to put the knight on a square, where it also creates a threat to one of white's pieces. And so the move is knight c4. Now, knight f3, you guys, I actually think would be a bit sloppy, because after rook takes f3, rook e1 check, I don't have to take the rook. I can play bishop f1. And after rook takes d1, because you've played knight f3, you have positioned white's rook on the ideal square to take on f2. So the move knight c4 is much stronger. Rook takes d4, rook e1 check, and Wojciech resigned, because after king h2, rook takes d1, rook takes f4. Who can tell me what black's most simple liquidation is to a completely winning position? Black can simply win decisive amount of material here with a very nice final mini combination. We need to notice that the king and the bishop are on the same rank, which means that if we put the rook on d2, it is essentially a fork. We can start with the move f1 queen, or we can immediately play rook d2. It doesn't even matter. Rook d2 is probably even stronger, because the threat of rook takes b2 as well as f1 queen, even f1 knight, is a threat of checkmate and 2. And so Wojciech resigned after rook e1 check. And that was an amazing game, 39 moves. And it really all started with this incredible idea, not of capturing on f3. That's pretty normal, although you don't see that every day. But this idea of bishop takes c3 is going to go down as, I believe, a symbol, an epitome of modern chess. Like, if you want a mental reference of modern chess, then that is the move bishop takes c3, a move that 25, 30 years ago even would have been laughed out of the tournament hall. You know, if you play a move like this, you know, you would have gotten your hands chopped off in Russia. But nowadays, the importance of concrete factors has really become the most important, the most important evaluative notion in any position. It's not really about these general principles. You can give up any piece in any position as long as there are specific factors that justify it. And in this case, the weakness of white's central pawn bind, combined with the slight awkwardness and passivity of the bishops, meant that in this very specific case, black's two knights are able to overpower, with the help of this very important move, queen f6, are able to overpower the two bishops. And as a consequence, Fabi was able to win a pawn. I do believe that queen c2 may have afforded better defensive chances, because queen b1, maybe Wojciech just missed queen e6. But once Fabi won the pawn and repositioned his queen and his knights on ideal squares, the game was essentially decided, and the rest was a matter of bringing the pieces in very patiently to the kingside, and it culminated in a absolutely brilliant attacking sequence where Fabi sacrifices one of his knights for the greater good. Okay. That was tough. Sorry, I talked too much, but I hope that made at least a little bit of sense. I do think that it was prep, and I'm actually quite confident that bishop takes c3 was prep. I think finding this move over the board is possible. I wouldn't rule it out from someone like Fabi. Jonathan, thank you for gifting to Top Man in Gaming. I wouldn't rule it out from someone like Fabi, but I would say it's highly unlikely that that bishop takes c3 is outcompeted over the board, particularly since I can see the time, although maybe 6 minutes. He spent 6 minutes. Maybe he did find it over the board. And Robert brings up a great point here. It may not have been exact prep in this position. Okay, it may not have been that Fabi looked at this exact position on his computer and saw bishop takes c3, but it could very well be that this idea of bishop takes c3 was something that he noticed in a slightly different position, perhaps within the same opening. There was a different position in which bishop takes c3 occurred, and so he borrowed that idea from that position, and that's what might explain the 6 minutes of thinking. If he started completely from scratch, I think he would have thought longer than 6 minutes. But as it stood, I think that's a very plausible hypothesis. Wow, something wise by GMS. He was trying to figure out whether it is worthwhile to apply that idea to this position, and the answer is yes. Now, I would be curious to do a position search and see if I can find any similar examples of somebody earlier doing something similar. Let me see if I can kind of do that. Just give me a moment. Let me see if I can find, for you guys, anything even resembling an idea like this. Let's see if I can run a little search. Okay, so just very quickly, this game between a relatively unknown player and Igor Ivanov, who unfortunately passed away early, but he was a grandmaster who, of course, Russian, but he moved to Canada in his later years. Very, very strong player. And he was facing off against the 2300. So we can see a very similar opening. Very similar opening. But this time c5 was played rather than e5. So there's bishop takes f3 and cd. Very similar position, except, yeah, basically almost identical position, in fact. With the exception that there's an e-pawn rather than a c-pawn. And after knight c6, rook c8, queen a5, knight d7, knight c5, and rook f2. And guess what Igor Ivanov played in this position? And again, this is a bit of a different situation, but I just want to show that the concept itself was around for a while. Bishop takes c3. So he gives up that bishop for the knight. And his idea is very similar to that of Fabi. He goes knight e5, and this weakness of the e4 pawn is what makes the position very awkward for white. White cannot move the bishop back to e2 because he loses the pawn. But if he doesn't, then he risks getting his pawn structure ruined with knight takes f3. And ultimately, Ivanov won a very long game. He did trade on f3. And ultimately, he won with a sort of a multi-pronged assault on white's position. The rest of the game doesn't interest me that much, but this kind of stuff does exist. Yes, Caruana performed a careful study of these games, of course. But in any case, that's a little bit about the Fabi game. I think it's good to pause there. So let's go back to the grind just for a little bit.